The criminal trial of former Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez has just begun 2 weeks after he was extradited to the United States to stand trial for drug smuggling charges. And an interesting thing happened recently in his trial. His defense lawyers were requesting that U.S. Presidents Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden testify at his trial, and they also requested former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Why is that? Let's talk about it. Sadly, a lot of Americans are just totally unaware that the United States, for the past 8 years, was backing the dictator of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez. While Americans were clapping at Barack Obama during his 8 years in office, the Obama administration supported repression and terrible authoritarian government in Honduras during his 8 years in office. The U.S. government as a whole was backing terrible leaders like Pepe Lobo and Juan Orlando Hernandez. So Juan Orlando Hernandez was frequently called an important U.S. ally during his 8 years in office from 2014 until January 2022. The Obama administration, the Trump administration, and just last year, even the Biden-Harris administration were working with the Juan Orlando Hernandez regime in Honduras. And he was always called an important U.S. ally, a credible partner in fighting drugs. And now all of a sudden, when his term ended in January 2022, then the U.S. finds him no longer useful, and they request his extradition, and now they're putting him on trial. And Juan Orlando Hernandez and his defense lawyers are calling out the hypocrisy of the U.S. government in doing this. And yeah, the U.S. government is hypocritical. They knew Juan Orlando Hernandez was a terrible leader, that he and his people in his government were drug smugglers, they were repressive, they were corrupt, and their terrible repression and policies were only making more people in Honduras leave, going to Mexico to the U.S. border. The U.S. is hypocritical. They could have done something about Juan Orlando Hernandez while he was president, and they didn't do anything until his term ended this year. And so Juan Orlando Hernandez and his defense lawyers have a point. The U.S. is totally hypocritical, and I do agree that Obama, Biden, and Trump and others, U.S. officials, they do need to be involved in this trial. They do need to give a testimony and give an account. They are involved in this. So some of the other people that the defense team of Juan Orlando Hernandez has requested to subpoena to testify in this trial include General John Kelly. General John Kelly, I mentioned in one of my previous videos about Juan Orlando Hernandez. John Kelly was the commander of U.S. Southern Command from 2012 until 2016 and was a big ally of Juan Orlando Hernandez in the U.S. military. And John Kelly also then later served in the Trump administration as his Secretary of Homeland Security and then later his chief of staff before he ended up getting fired by Donald Trump. John Kelly spoke highly of Juan Orlando Hernandez repeatedly and called him a great guy. And also, Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who was in the Trump administration, has also been requested by Juan Orlando Hernandez's defense lawyers to testify in this trial against Juan Orlando Hernandez. Mike Pompeo, as Secretary of State, embraced Juan Orlando Hernandez frequently and called him an ally of the U.S. also. Here's another important fact that needs to be included in the trial against Juan Orlando Hernandez. the DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, opened an investigation against Juan Orlando Hernandez back in 2013 when he was running for president for the first time. The DEA was investigating Juan Orlando Hernandez for taking bribes from drug traffickers. So already the U.S. government had suspicions that Juan Orlando Hernandez was involved in drug trafficking and was taking drug bribes, and now the U.S. Justice Department is openly saying that Juan Orlando Hernandez and his younger brother Tony Hernandez have been involved in drug trafficking going back to 2004. So if the U.S. government, if U.S. officials had been aware going back to 2004 that the Hernandez family were involved in drug trafficking and taking bribes from drug smugglers, then the U.S. government had no credibility when it was calling Juan Orlando Hernandez a credible partner of the United States in the fight against drug trafficking from 2014 to 2021. So many U.S. government officials, including in the DEA, knew better. They knew he was corrupt. They knew he was a narcotics trafficker and taking bribes. And yet, they didn't do anything about it until his presidential term limit ended because the United States didn't care how corrupt Juan Orlando Hernandez was. He was serving U.S. political and economic interests in Honduras, in the U.S.'s dominance and control of Honduras. When I was reading a report, an article from the Univision network, they did an recent article about the trial of Juan Orlando Hernandez, and of course made parallels between the trial of General Manuel Noriega of Panama and President Juan Orlando Hernandez going on right now. The parallels being General Manuel Antonio Noriega, who was the dictator of Panama in the 1980s, was a longtime ally of the United States going back to the 1960s. We all know the story. Noriega was a graduate of the U.S. School of the Americas program back in 1967 and was a rotten, dirty, corrupt guy involved in criminal activities like cocaine trafficking, gun running, and was a very repressive dictator who killed his critics and was a paid intelligence asset by the U.S. CIA from 1971 to about 1987. And then the U.S. ended up invading Panama and overthrowing General Noriega in 1989. And then they took him captive in DEA custody, flew him to the U.S., and he was put on trial back in 1991. And during his trial, Manuel Noriega requested that President George Bush as well as Ronald Reagan testify at his trial, since Bush and Reagan initially were allies of Manuel Noriega. George Bush, when he was director of the CIA in the 1970s, was once photographed sitting on a couch with Manuel Noriega, and Bush was part of the paying Manuel Noriega a $100,000 a year salary. And, of course, Reagan and Bush did not testify at Noriega's trial, but he and his defense team tried to subpoena them, as well as other U.S. officials who originally called Noriega an ally and then later betrayed him. One more thing that comes to my mind with the trials of Manuel Noriega and Juan Orlando Hernandez is the action movie Die Hard 2 from 1990. And those who remember the movie Die Hard 2 with Bruce Willis, the plot is set at the Dulles International Airport, where a Latin American dictator named General Ramon Esperanza, who was originally a U.S. ally, and then later the U.S. stopped supporting him, ends up being overthrown by his people, and then he's being extradited to the United States to stand trial for drug trafficking and other crimes. And the U.S. military figures who supported General Ramon Esperanza ended up taking over the Dulles International Airport to try to free him from going to trial in the United States and help him escape, where the bad guy, Colonel Stewart, who was a U.S. Special Forces guy who supported General Esperanza because of anti-communist ideology. And I'm thinking about that movie Die Hard 2, the whole plot, the premise with, U.S. military figures who are involved in all this mess. Like when Oliver North was a supporter of Manuel Noriega in the 80s, and now with General John Kelly and also Admiral Craig Fowler of the U.S. Southern Command, who backed Juan Orlando Hernandez, and now their names are being dragged into the trial of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Will any real justice happen? That's yet to be seen.
Yeah, I can see